Welcome to Brainthropology. Let's talk about our amazing brain and the issues that get us stuck. We all have those moments where life gets overwhelming. It can be related to injury or illness, or an issue with your kids, or just because life is crazy and we need a little help and encouragement. Our team of therapists, expert guests, and clients are here to deep dive into the topics that matter most. We will share information with our listeners that encourages, educates, and empowers. We discuss and provide practical tools and strategies to change lives. We invite you into our community. But be prepared. This listener community is built through vulnerability and might at times be raw and emotional. We are here to provide free hope and support to those who need it most. Our Brainthropology team includes creative and inspirational board-certified occupational therapists, Courtney Wang, Dr. Jessica Smith, Debbie Loftus, and host Meg Scaling.
This episode is brought to you by Galaxy Brain and Therapy Center, helping clients live their best lives by implementing strategies such as those discussed in this podcast. Galaxy Brain and Therapy Center is located in Ann Arbor, Michigan, serving southeastern Michigan for in-person and community-based services. Out-of-state virtual and teletherapy services available for OT, PT, speech, mental health, and mindfulness. Check out their website at galaxybraincenter.com.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Brainthropology. I am here with Debbie Loftus and Jessica Smith. I'm your host, Meg Scaling, and today we're going to talk about something fascinating. We are going to talk about the human brain. And we're not going to talk about it lecture style like most of us have had in college where you're sitting in a boring classroom learning about the parts of the brain. We are actually going to talk about it in real life terms. The parts of the brain, the areas of the brain, how it affects our kids, our families, our loved ones, those who have had injuries. And so we really hope that you enjoy the next couple sessions because it will be foundational building blocks for some of the other conversations where we really will dive deeper into all of the areas of the brain that are so important and talk about them more specifically. But today, it has been a stressful week for me at work, and all good stress, but even good stress is stress. And so we make it a practice to start with personal and professional positives during our meetings, and I'm going to carry that into today. So I'm going to start by asking the ladies here what your personal or professional positive is for today.
I'll start. My personal positive is we are moving, and so we are finally getting unpacked and my office is set up. I guess that kind of overflows to a professional positive too, because it gets me in a better place for work. When my environment is structured, I have more structure in life. So it's been good to have that.
Awesome. Thank you. What about you, Debbie? What's your positive?
I have so many positives this week. So this past week is my favorite week of the entire year. We always do a family reunion, and because of COVID, we haven't been able to do it for the last 2 years. And we combined it with my daughter's graduation party. So all of my to-do lists last week are checked off, and it was a fabulous party, and I had a week of joy, and my cup is full. So that was my positive.
I love that. My positive is just as simple. Sometimes on a hard week, you just have to find simple things that make you happy. And I think my positive is the rain. It has been so dry outside, and my grass is watered, and the flowers and the weeds in my flower beds are watered, but everything's watered. And so that's my positive. I was really happy to hear it pouring this morning. So let's start off this podcast by talking about our favorite brain facts, because the brain is fascinating. And what's your favorite part of the brain, Debbie? Or your brain fact?
Sure. There are so many fun facts about the brain. In casual conversation, because this is our specialization, we always talk about some fun things, some funny things. I know on that, there was a movie, what was it, Jerry Maguire, where the little boy was talking about how much the brain weighs. My favorite brain fact is that the brain isn't fully formed until around age 25. And this was mind-boggling when I found this out, because, and a very positive for my children, because I have to remind myself that I have 2 teenagers, and in all honesty, I have to give them grace because there are so many situations in life as a mother that we assume that our kids are doing because they know better, and in all reality, that's not the truth. That your brain is not formed until around age 25, especially certain areas of the brain, which we'll go into more detail, but there's an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, and it's responsible for rational thought. So if you think about a teenager and some of the choices, as moms all here, we have children of different ages, and we have a lot of inside jokes that will probably come out through this podcast, but it's helpful to remember that going throughout your day, when you have teens and you get those phone calls, that they really do need some grace because their rational thought part of the brain just is not formed. So I think that's
Amen,
a really neat,
sister.
Yeah,
I can
really
relate
cool
to
tip.
that.
Yeah.
I can relate to that. I feel like my 15-year-old didn't like me until she was 18.
Well, I'm almost there.
Oh my goodness. Jessica, what's your favorite brain fact?
So mine also relates to my kids. I just had a daughter that turned 1 this past week. And it is so fascinating that actually when a baby is born, the brain is only about 1/4 of the size of an average adult brain. And the first year of their life, their brain size doubles. And by age 3, it's about 80% grown. And so if you think of all that their little brain does that first year of life, it's so fascinating. And just watching it and experiencing that first year just happened. It makes me sad a little bit that it's over because I'm like, it's not over. Her brain will develop until she's 25. But I mean, just watching all of her connections, and even as they start to reach for things, like, that connections are being formed. And so my husband still kind of rolls his eyes and laughs, like, as she does stuff. I'm like, her little brain, and those connections. And he's like, oh, you are such a brain nerd. And I am. I love it. So I think that's a fun fact that I just love.
That is fun. And that is fun. And just seeing your kids go through all those different phases, from young kiddos to young adults to mature adults. I actually read an article this week that talked about how they think some areas of the brain actually don't develop until the 30s, which is
that's interesting.
Interesting. I know. That's really interesting.
So we're going to be wearing our parenting hat longer than we thought?
I guess so. Right. I think one of my fun facts is a little less personal, but I love thinking about the brain as it's made up of 60% fat, because fat has gotten such a bad rap over the years, and we need good fat. And if anyone has had a brain injury, you know that they need to be eating a really good diet full of good fats, the walnuts, the avocados, that Mediterranean diet. And I think that's just important to remember, that the brain needs fat and water to survive.
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right. So I think, we talked about different ways to set up this podcast and how to talk about the brain, because there's so many ways we can do it. And we all agreed that one of our favorite parts of the brain is that it has 2 hemispheres, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And those 2 hemispheres have slightly different jobs that they focus on. And while we need both hemispheres and we use both hemispheres, it is so fascinating that the left side does certain things and the right side does certain things. And there's something in the middle called a corpus callosum that you don't have to remember that name, but you just have to remember that there is a part in the middle that all the information from the left side of the brain crosses over to the right side, and all the information from the right side of the brain crosses over to the left side. And this is why your left side of your brain controls your right side of your body, and your right side of your brain controls your left side of your body. So when I lift my left hand up, it's actually my right brain that is doing the work. And I just think that is so fascinating. And so, ladies, let's talk about one side of the brain first and all of the aspects that one side of the brain covers. And then we can talk about the other side. I don't really care where we start, but if we want to, we can start with the left side of the brain.
That's my favorite one.
That's your favorite.
Could you have guessed?
Well, Are you left-handed or right-handed?
I'm right-handed.
Okay, you're right-handed. I'm left-handed.
And I'm right-handed.
And you're right-handed. Okay.
It's very obvious.
You think so?
I do think it is obvious.
Well,
Once
let's
we
talk
dive
about
into
why
this.
it's obvious. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's all just bring up some facts about the left side of the brain and what it does for ourselves and our body. And I don't care who goes first. Bring up a few of the things you want to talk about.
One of my favorite things about the left brain is linear thinking. So I'm known for being quite organized, and I love having step-by-step directions. It reminds me of our first podcast, actually, when we were talking about being vulnerable, because going into a podcast, you don't realize how many things can come up that you don't expect. So that's out of my comfort zone. But I love that the left side of the brain allows me to be organized and create step-by-step directions, thinking about things in an orderly and systematic way. And that gives me my calm, which is very interesting because I think when you're left or right-sided, and you actually will listen to this podcast and realize there's one that's dominant. So we're going to kind of dive into that. But I think Jessica and I are quite similar with that. What would you say, Jess?
Yeah, I definitely lean towards the left brain. It's the logical, like that reasoning piece. We think in words, right? So when you're thinking, we're list makers. We like to make our lists for our lists and then cross them off and have everything kind of in that structure. It's the language side. Give me the facts, right? And it's how we remember words of songs, and it's all of that language and that language processing. And we like to talk about things. We like the details. We like the nitty gritty details, right? And yeah, it's very linear mathematics.
I was going to ask you, are you both good at math? Because
Surprisingly, and that's what when I was thinking if I was left or right brained, I'm not. I'm okay with math, but I don't love it. So
I actually scored the highest on math on my ACT, but if you ask me if I like it, the answer is no. Yeah. And people joke that I'm not very good at it, but oddly enough, I test well in it. So interesting.
And that shows you that just because you don't have one attribute or another of left or right brain. I mean, obviously we have both sides, but there definitely is a dominant.
Yeah.
And that leads me to you, Meg.
So this is not me, but let's stay on this left brain for just a minute because I love you two, and I love that you two are like that because I need you in my life. There's no doubt about that. Tell me about someone you know. You don't have to name names, but you can. That is kind of left brain dominant, and maybe what their job is and what they're good at, so that our listeners can say, oh yeah, I know someone like that, or I can relate to that.
I mean, a couple examples as far as occupation goes. I have a really good friend that's an accountant, and she cannot get enough of numbers. I mean, she thinks numbers. When she's planning parties, everything's about numbers, costs and budgeting, and that's just not my forte. But that is hers. Also, Jessica and I were talking about this earlier, that many engineers are left brain. Do you have any engineers that you know, Jess, that have some of those?
So that was going to be my example, is a friend that's an engineer, and less emotional, but very just, list-driven, task-driven, has to get this done, has to get this done, has to get this done in a sequenced, organized fashion. Planning, agendas, everything is, okay, we have to do this and then this. And so it's very interesting.
I think I have to give a kudos to my husband who's like this, because he's the person who has the family calendar and the lacrosse calendar and the soccer calendar. And then he's got our vacation plan, and he's got the hotels booked, and they're all linked up. And I don't know what I would do without him, but he moves his inbox, and his email is empty, and he moves everything into a file. So at the end of the day, he keeps no text messages, no emails. Everything is cleaned out every day. And that is my brain. I have to leave them there, or else I won't know what to do. I won't know where to find the information. So I love that. I love those logical thinkers. There's so much good stuff. And I think maybe we could talk now about a little bit of so people who have had injuries to that left side of the brain, there's real issues with that too. So think about all the things that the left brain does, and then all the things that they're lacking now if the injury is on that left side, that logical thought, that logical reasoning, the sequencing. I think that's really important to talk about that. Do you have clients in mind or goals in mind that you've worked on with clients in the past that were simple goals, but it was because that part of their brain was damaged?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we work a lot on executive functioning, and that stems from the left side, the planning piece and creating those calendars that you talked about. When you have damage, some people, my mom does not use a calendar, yet keeps everything in her mind and uses it. Now, if someone like her had an injury and no longer can use that side of their brain as they typically would, we'd have to put a system in place, such as making a color-coded calendar and a calendar for your family events, a calendar for any extracurriculars, anything like that. So just even time management and planning how long something is going to take. That seems like I feel like we take that for granted. So I can kind of make a list in my head and know that, hey, doing the laundry will take me about 45 minutes, but that can be a goal, just estimating how long something can take and planning and that forward thought. So things like that we take advantage of, and we work on that with our clients who've had injury to that left side.
Absolutely. I know, Debbie, sequencing is something that you've worked on with a client before.
It is. Well, and I think, before we go further, executive functioning is such an important term that we use as occupational therapists. And just to define that a little further, there are so many different areas of executive functioning that we work on. Some examples, as Jessica said, with planning, ability to anticipate, prioritize events, self-monitoring, initiation, ability to transition between tasks. And some of that relates to this side of the brain that we're talking about when it's injured. So for example, if you're creating a budget or you're trying to balance a checkbook, that's an executive function that is essential. We've gone into people's homes that unfortunately, because they lack that skill and they lacked the knowledge that they lack that skill, that, their house is being taken away because they didn't pay their bill and they don't have that initiation skill. So,
there are real life consequences to
Absolutely.
that. And I know we're going to talk more about that when we talk in a future episode about that frontal lobe that really does so much of that executive functioning. But it's really important to mention here today that if you have a family member that has an injury to that left side, that might be why they're not good at the things they were good at before, or why they need extra help in some areas. All right, let's move to my favorite side of the brain. I don't know if it's my favorite side or it's just the side that comes easy to me. The side that describes me best, the right side of the brain. And this is the side of the brain that I will describe as very creative, and sometimes so creative I can't sleep at night. I think I work creatively in my brain at night. I think I've mentioned that before, but oftentimes turning my brain off is really hard. It's the area of the brain that is spontaneous. And I know that, like, while my husband will plan a trip, I'll be like, ooh, pull over. That looks great. I want to learn more about this. I want to, explore this one stop, or look at the flowers. I wonder what kind they are. Let's explore that. And it wasn't a part of our agenda, but it's where my brain wants to go and explore. So that's the part where, you're really in touch with feelings and emotions. And I think where a lot of our highly sensitive clients that have this high sensitivity are probably more right-brained. What are your thoughts on right brain?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us have some part of the things that you described. But the right brain is so fascinating. I mean, without the right brain, we wouldn't have artists. We wouldn't have these amazing creative spirits. And you'll also find in that part of the brain that a lot of it's nonverbal communication. So using body language instead of talking to somebody, and using visualization. You can picture something, what will look like if you go into a room and you're decorating something, which why, Meg, you're such an awesome decorator.
Yeah, there is some people that say, like, how can you do that? Like, I could plan out our space, look at 2 empty rooms and figure out, okay, we need to put walls up here and walls up here. And I can just picture it front to to end in about 5 seconds. And people say, how can you do that? I'm like, how can you not do that? Isn't that something everyone can do?
No, I will say no, because I cannot. Like, I need you, Meg. This is why we need right and left brain. I cannot visualize. Like, we're moving in and Meg is going to come to my house and tell me what needs to go where, because that stresses me out. Like, I cannot visualize. Even house hunting was hard because I can't say, oh, we could knock down this wall and we could do this. I cannot visualize space. Give me a list, give me like what I need to do. And so,
well, I appreciate you telling me, Meg, you have to leave or we're going to be late for the podcast. So we all need each other. That's for sure.
Definitely.
You know, one of the things that right brain people are is very holistic in thinking. So I think the difference too is left brain people are very linear. Like you go from A to B to C to D. And like when I do a storyboard, like when I make a list during meetings, it almost looks like an explosion happened on the dry erase board.
Yeah,
like accurate.
And all of my friends who are not right brained are like, I can't even look at that. That is just so disturbing to look at. And me, it's just like, oh, well, I just need it to look like a big visual picture, and I get it, but everyone else is like, I need to erase that and make it all straight lines.
So can we just chat a second about prepping for this podcast? Maybe is a perfect example. Debbie and I are like, okay, so the titles will be all, the same font and and
color coded.
Yes. And then we went in and Meg exploded on it. And it was amazing because we're like, she thought of so many things, but it was totally that like holistic thinking. And I think the fancy term they're using now is like, well, they've been using it for a long time, but it's really becoming more popular, is like the German word, it's Gestalt, right? And it's Gestalt processing. And it's like that whole picture processing. So it's like Meg can just look at the whole picture and then she can pick out pieces, and she's amazing at everything you touch is like gold. It just turns out so amazing. But the process of how you do it versus how Debbie and I were doing it, we're like, whoa, our brains are in two different places.
We're like, can we plug in so we know what you're thinking? Because you're only showing us the big picture and we're seeing.
We were actually sitting here getting ready to hit play, and I was like, all right, I need to do positives today because I've had one of those days. And both your eyes were like, we did not plan on that. We did not plan on starting with positive. Both of you, I could read it in your body language. You were thrown off that I was going to make you give a positive on the spot.
Yes.
Well, I gave you 30-second warning.
Thanks, Meg. Spontaneous.
So when you think about someone who might be right-brained, what you mentioned artists.
Yeah, I actually, one of my favorite people on the planet, she is an artist, and just fascinates me that we can be on a walk and she will look at a tree, and within 10 seconds, she can tell me immediately 3 different things that she can do with that tree. She's like, oh my gosh, I could paint this in watercolor. I could cut the bark and I could make coasters. I could take, a leaf and I could press that into a book cover. And I'm like, what in the world? That's just a tree, right? Like, beautiful tree. Don't get me wrong. And I could visualize painting maybe, but I find it so fascinating. That somebody can have that much talent from being that side of the brain.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, when we are under times of stress, we usually we use our dominant side. So I obviously did well in math too. I mean, I guess it's not obvious, but I did do well in math. And there are things that you do that are very creative and that are spontaneous. We're not just one side, but in stressful situations, we definitely tend to lend and lean on our more dominant side. What do you think it means to have a dominant side? What does a dominant side look like in people?
Yeah, I think we talked about that and hinted, like, I tend to, go towards that like linear piece. But it doesn't mean that I can't see a whole picture, right? It just means that that's kind of where I start, and that it may help me through the process. I am not artistic though. Like, I am creative, but I will tell you the last few years I've been under more stress. Just, it's good stress, positive stress, but like you said, it's still stress. And I find that under stress, my creative side is just not there. And it's hard. And so I think that's where when you talk about your dominant side, it's like really you see that come out under stress. And if you think even just think marriage or, your significant other, your partner, when you have stress and you're on two different processing levels, how hard that can be, right? So that can get really sticky really fast if I'm completely relying on my dominant side, which is my right side, and my husband's in that, my left side, and my husband's in the right side. It's just like we can't, communicate, which is kind of where things can get rough and you ride the waves.
Love that you brought that up, because it just lends into why we do a part B of every podcast and that mindfulness piece, because it's so important that we tap into the good in both sides. Like for me, I have to get to that mindfulness piece and center myself so I have what it takes to look at our annual budget, or to look at the monthly budget, or to do the things that a CEO has to do that isn't my jam, but still my responsibility. And that mindfulness practice is so important. In fact, I had mindfulness this morning. Wednesday mornings are my mindfulness mornings, and we're recording on a Wednesday, and I needed it and I loved it. Yeah. But it helps me to be able to process and use both sides efficiently. Yeah. I love that you said that. Okay. So what does it look like if, especially in pediatrics, if we don't have a dominant side? They talked about this a little bit in one of the courses we took recently on reflex integration, but I know child's dominance doesn't always develop until, second or third grade sometimes, but usually you see dominance start early. So one, let's talk about how do we know what side we're dominant, and what are some signs of dominance? And then we'll get into what happens when we don't have a dominance.
Yeah, interesting enough, we can be right-handed dominant, left eye dominant, and right foot dominant, and it doesn't always correlate. So it's not complete side dominance. Carla Hannaford has a book called The Dominance Factor, and there she walks through all of the variations. She has a drawing, and so it's like a brain, an eye, an ear, hand, and feet. And so you can be one of the variations, and there's 32 different variations in that book. So, someone can be right eye dominant, but left ear dominant. And if you kind of picture yourself to figure out what's what, we talked a little bit about the sides of the brain. So you can kind of guess which dominant side you are for your brain. Let's talk about the eye dominance. So if you take your thumb and you use both eyes and line it up with something vertical and get it in alignment with something vertical, and go ahead and close one eye and then close the other.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
And so the one that moves is your non-dominant side. So the one that stays in alignment with your object is your dominant eye. So for me, when I align with both eyes and I close my left eye, my right eye keeps my thumb there. When I close my left eye, it jumps over. So for me, that means I'm right eye dominant. Let's talk about your ear. How do you know what ear is dominant? And some of you may have an idea, but if you were picture yourself standing in a room and there's a door across the room and someone knocks on it and you have to go over there and lean up against it to try to hear what's going on the other side of the door, what ear do you put up to that door? And for me, I know it's my right. What about you ladies?
It's actually my left, but it was my right eye.
I think it's my left. It is my right eye as well. There's actually a joke that we have in my house, and my kids are going to be embarrassed if they won't watch the podcast. They don't care what I'm doing, but they bring this up all the time because they say that when they're talking, I lean in and I give a look, and you probably know the look, and it's some look that is apparently it's this look that's like, are you in trouble? Or like, did you say what I think you said? And it's not, they're not in trouble, but I'm leaning in and I'm trying to hear. And they're like, Mom, you're giving that look again. I was like, I'm just left ear dominant. And they are like, they all like almost fell off of their chairs laughing at me because they're like, what the heck does that even mean? But that was my excuse.
Yeah. And you're right eye dominant. So you're like trying to look with your right eye, lean in with your left ear.
My kids say that I do the look, but it's like my eyes open. Maybe my right eye opens more than my left, but you're giving us the look. So we all have our look as well.
Oh my gosh. Our beautiful brains.
Beautiful brains.
So is it important to have a hand dominance? I think because you hear when kids don't have that, there's this level of confusion, right?
Yeah. So imagine like not knowing, just being completely lost in what hand to even pick up the pencil with. How do we expect writing or fine motor skills if we don't have that dominance? Now, I will say it's important to use both sides of our body, but it is also important to have that dominance. Otherwise, and you see this in kids where they're just completely lost and confused because no one's a leader, right? So it's like there's no leader in their body. No one's taking over. And imagine that, like if you just were kind of in a situation, I like to use the example of teammates versus competitors, right? So if your brain hemispheres are teammates and they're working together and one's the leader and the other one's kind of following and you're really getting a task done and working together, that's awesome, right? You get far. If they're competing against each other constantly, what does it lead to? Nothing.
Chaos. Yeah. If I kept thinking like, should I do this thing the way Jessica's going to do it or the way I want to do it or my left brain or my right brain? Like if you weren't making a decision as to how to approach something or what your strategy will be to get a task done, then the task doesn't get done.
And you're just lost, right? And you're in that constant spinning circle of where do I go? What do I do? So
it reminds me of that quote, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So you have to prioritize how you're going to get a task done. And then, like you said, both parts of the brain will team to get it done.
Yep.
So I think that it is important to also bring up the fact that if we are left-handed like I am, there's a good chance we have a lot of right brain tendencies. And if you are right-handed, there is a good chance you would have left brain tendencies, but it's not a hard fact, like you said.
Yeah. So there's in those 32 profiles in the dominance factor, she describes that, right? So someone can be right-brained and right-handed, and someone can be left-brained and left-handed. So it's not a hard fact that just because you're right brain dominant means you're left hand dominant or vice versa. You see this also in sports, gross motor. So you probably know many people who say, well, I write with my right hand, but I play hockey left-handed and I play golf left-handed, but I actually bowl right-handed. So even amongst gross motor, there can be a mix. And it's really, hand dominance there is links genetically to hand dominance. So, but there's also influence environmentally too. And so we've heard those stories of, oh, well, my grandmother or someone I know was forced to write with their right hand. And the amazing thing is our brain can learn that. And so that gives us hope after injury, right? So someone's right-handed, they get injured, and all of a sudden they have to learn to do things with their left hand. Our brain can do it, which is awesome. And so I challenge all of us to brush your teeth with your left hand, right? It's going to kind of force new pathways, and it'll feel so funny in the beginning. And if you keep doing it, like do it for 30 days. And I guarantee by day like 20, 25, it'll be like, oh, okay, your left hand will know what to do. So we can train our brain different ways, but the dominance piece is also fun to know and use.
Yeah, that makes me think of crossing midline and the importance of crossing midline. And, a question came up talking about whether or not you try and help your kids, if they're using one hand all the time, do you help their kids to try and get them to use the other? And that importance of crossing midline for development, but also still allowing that hand dominance to form as well. Yeah, Debbie, you have made so much progress crossing midline with some of your clients. You're really good about documenting that and showing the difference from before and after so the clients can see the changes. A lot of times you don't always feel the changes, but why don't you talk a little bit about clients that you have crossed midline with and what that looks like?
Absolutely. As far as documentation goes initially, it's so important, just a tidbit for therapists out there, to do video documentation. Obviously, you need a signed release, HIPAA compliance. But in taking some of the courses that we have with whole brain exercises, we find that it's so important because sometimes you miss things when you're doing written documentation, and we've seen so much improvement, which is, it's just great to see. And it's good documentation for the insurance companies if you ever get questioned. But as far as, case studies, just amazing results. When you have somebody that has a brain injury and you're doing an assessment as an occupational therapist, and some of the questions that you ask somebody is, can you touch your right hand to your left knee? And that seems like such a simple task. And somebody right in front of you holds their hand up and they just stop. They cannot cross midline. And it's just fascinating. So as a therapist, there's so many different things you can do to encourage that. The reason that we want somebody to cross midline, it activates both hemispheres at the same time. So if there's damage in one, we want to try to facilitate that. Improves communication from one side of the brain to the other. As we're doing these exercises, though, we see that the outcomes are so functional. So as occupational therapists, we find it so important to use meaningful activities. One of my clients, in doing this, she really was struggling. We use a simple technique. It's called the cross crawl, where we have both hands up. And as I said before, we simply tap the opposite knee going up and down. And when I had this person initially do this, she could not do it. And so I asked her what her favorite song was. And her favorite song is You Are My Sunshine. And so really quick, we got a YouTube video and put it on. And instantly, within seconds, she was able to cross midline.
And she's an artist.
Yes.
And she's right-brained.
Right.
And rhythm and timing is on the right side.
Right. So she was able to do this. Now, the minute you took the music away, she couldn't cross midline. So as we trained that neural pathway and that pattern of movement, we were able to do the opposite side. So then we took her left side and we were able to touch her right knee. Her goal was to be able to either play the piano, play the guitar, or sing again. Never did she imagine, a year and a half later, with lots of help from different disciplines. After we got the ball rolling, I had a music therapist involved, and phenomenal that we have a recording of her playing her guitar, standing up, which she has gait problems, without a cane, and playing her guitar and singing at the same time. So just phenomenal. And just from these small movements that we've learned and we've cultivated at Galaxy through many different programs. We've used figure eights, we've used from different programs, and we put our own spin on it and adding meaningful things like music and rhythm and timing. But phenomenal results in coupling what we know as a therapist, using meaningful activities and crossing midline and having people, incorporate things that they get joy out of. So, and that's our goal, is to bring joy back to people. So
I love that. So many amazing stories about left and right brain and the uniqueness that each side of the brain brings. I think one thing we should mention before we close out today is talking about how well much of the left brain crosses the corpus callosum on the right side, and the right brain crosses to innervate the movement on the left side. Do you guys know, fun fact, there is one organ that actually not only crosses, but also unilaterally innervates its own side as well. Do you know what that is?
Our amazing eyes.
I was just going to say
Ding,
vision.
ding, ding. You've got it.
Ding, ding, ding. We need a little buzzer.
Eyes. So when you think about that, it shows how important vision is to our whole nervous system, because we rely so much on vision in so many ways, and we'll have a whole podcast on vision. But it's really interesting that is the one thing that not only crosses, but it also innervates the same side. And thank goodness it does that. It's like a backup system. So if something goes wrong, you have this backup system that still is going to get information to that same side and cross the other side.
And just for therapists to know too, like that when you have an injury, whether it be stroke, any type of injury to the brain, vision is so important to assess. It can tell us so much, and it can also be so wonky, right? Like there's so many visual disturbances. There's so many vision issues that can come about, and it's just super important to assess. And then also rehab, because you can gain so much through vision rehab, and it's really important.
And if it's not your specialty, just know that there are so many vision rehab and different physicians out there that, specialize in that.
Right. And I think it would be fun for, just like you did with vision dominance, for the listeners to try and do what Debbie was describing as the cross crawl, where you put your left hand on your right knee and you kind of go back and forth, hitting your left hand and your right knee and hand and left knee. And then while you're doing that, try and keep that going and like visually track a window frame or a door frame or the outside of a picture frame in your house, and see how hard it is. When you start challenging multiple sides of your brain and multiple parts of your brain at the same time, it is hard. And then when you add singing to that, try doing that and counting or singing or naming animals. This is where we really can start challenging the brain in fun and fascinating ways.
We should do a whole podcast on that. We would have so much fun.
Oh my gosh, our brain will be so tired, but we will do that. For sure, we will do that. So let's just kind of recap a little bit and talk about a few takeaways from today. What we talked about is that, you have this amazing brain. A brain has a cerebral cortex, the outside part of the brain. And we think about that part of the brain as being like that squishy part that has all the folds and creases. And it's divided into two sides. And we have the left side and the right side. The right side is kind of our creative side. The left side is more of our logical side. And we use both, but we have this dominance factor that tends to lend one way or the other. And I think it's really important to point out one of the the biggest takeaway that I got from this podcast, and maybe you guys got something else, but was when Jessica talked about under stress, how we lean so heavy on our dominant side, and the importance of that mindfulness and just figuring out how to calm ourselves and get to a really good place where we can function and be able to use both sides effectively.
Absolutely. We need both sides, just like we need both dominant people, right and left brain dominant people, because they bring so much to the world, so much to society. But as individuals, we also need both sides of our brain. And so if we find ourselves leaning too heavily on one side or another, mindfulness is an amazing tool.
And don't be too hard on yourself. Yeah. Some things just don't come natural, and don't compare yourself to someone else who has strengths in other areas, because we all have strengths and we all need each other.
Absolutely. Yes. Grace is the word.
Give each other grace and self-compassion, right?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, ladies, it has been awesome. I loved learning about the brain and talking about the brain with you. And we will continue this discussion in podcasts in the future. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. We love comments. And so if you have anything you want us to talk about or anything you want us to talk about further, let us know and email us and we will get back with you.
And always remember, be courageous and move forward in your day with hope, joy, and purpose.
Absolutely.
While we love what we do and are as passionate as they come, the information on this podcast and discussion is for educational purposes only and should not replace professional medical advice. Please consult your own healthcare provider if you are seeking medical advice, diagnoses, or treatment for you or anyone else. We do our very best to provide correct information, but please understand science and medicine is ever-changing. We welcome feedback, comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. This disclaimer applies to any guest or contributors to the podcast or blog.